Thanks for the invitation to speak, and thanks everybody for joining us. I was going to introduce myself as well, but thank you for that. I would just add maybe that my roots or my initial training was ecology. So I think I'm kind of coming at this human dimensions and interdisciplinary work really through a kind of conservation starting point and yeah, a training in the more natural sciences, which I've kind of shared or at least integrated other approaches with over the years, which was really kind of inspired actually by early work with C4 back in 2005 when I was there with Francis Seymour and others putting together Forest Day. So anyway, today I'm going to talk to you about well-being. Let's just see if I can get this slide to, it's on that screen. So the structure of my talk is going to be, sorry about this pop-up. Oh well. We're going to be covering some impact evaluation sort of background across the spectrum of conservation and development. And then the next part, I'd like to just touch on some frameworks that have been used to approach plural valuation, and then something about methods. And then I'll wrap up at the end with an insight from some current research that actually Natalia and I are collaborating on, just to sort of show what it looks like in practice or in the field. Okay, so beginning then with a bit of background. Well, you're all probably aware of, there's been a lot of calls for more robust impact evaluation. Really with this understanding that resources are limited, a lot of sort of conservation and development money is coming from taxpayers' money, so there's also a sort of imperative to respond to them and show how investments are making a difference or not. Monitoring progress towards improvements is really important, not least because then we can also learn something about which strategies perform better than others and in what sorts of contexts, as well as the moral obligation to make sure interventions do no harm. And so I guess there's always been some form of evaluation to different degrees, but in 2006, Ferraro and colleagues, or 2004, published their paper about, money, is this money for nothing? We need more robust and better metrics, better ways of monitoring performance. And the ESPA research community or funding stream was also really interested in finding the evidence to highlight better the link between the environment and well-being. So at the same time then, you can combine that with the sort of observation that there's been an increasing merger or coupling between conservation and development funding, and they're sort of getting tighter together in the sense that often you find conservation is no longer happening in its own right. It's often including some form of social dimension. And that's really clear if you look at, for example, some of the leading traditionally wildlife friendly or wildlife focused conservation institutions like WWF and Flora and Fauna, for example. And now they all feature humans or people in their mission statements. So we can see it there. We can also obviously see in the SDGs, at that higher level, the integration of people in the environment. And of course, there's been this in the past, but I'm just kind of talking in the last decades. And then the Global Landscape Forum, which is a vehicle which is sort of amplifying this interest in integration through the landscape approach, which was born from C4, I guess, and is in that way part of the CG to some extent. And we can see evidence of this legacy. When I say legacy, I mean the sort of conservation development starting points of contemporary interventions. So this is again some work that Natalia and I pursued together in collaboration And we looked at a set of integrated landscape initiatives in Latin America, and we analysed them based on the motivations that led to their creation and also the actions which they pursued. And then through some cluster analysis, we found that there's a sort of stamp, if you like, of past legacy on these interventions, even integrated landscape initiatives. So we found that some seem to be more dominated by an agricultural focus, others more a conservation focus. And so those we in our typology assigned those as the least integrated types. They were still representative to some extent of more single sector roots. And then we found two types that really seemed to put on the stage a more integrated approach, working across scales with different partners in a sort of tighter collaboration. And then James Reed et al. Showed in their paper in 2016 also this kind of merging of concepts, fuzzy definitions, because there is this influence back and forth, which is evident in landscape approaches today. And I'm sure James spoke to you about that in the presentation he gave before. But of course, environmental facing interventions have the potential to impact human well-being, well-being beyond the economic sort of domain and material domain, but well-being in its multiple dimensions, because environment-facing interventions, wherever they are on that spectrum, have the capacity to influence people's use, access, rights to the land and to the resources. And so in that way, flows from nature, as well as relationships between people, which are so often embedded in place, can be impacted by interventions. The social networks and moral and gift economies, which are often strong in the sorts of sites that we're talking about, where landscape approaches or other forms of along the spectrum of environment-facing interventions take place. These are often rural landscapes in forest agricultural matrices, for example, and so there's a proximity of people living closer to the land. Of course, we all depend entirely on the land, but there is a proximity which is distinct from that in urban settings. And yet, at the same time, impact domains tend to be fairly standardized. We could think about agriculture in terms of yields often, or conservation in terms of biodiversity or hectares of forest, carbon, for example. Sometimes governance might be there, and is there a multi-stakeholder platform, or how is this operational? Might be in the impact metrics, although probably more rare. And then livelihoods and the social domain, when it is featured, I would say, and later we'll go on to look at the evidence of that, but often it's in an economic sense, or at least a material sort of sense. And so if we think about what we know in terms of the performance of environment-facing interventions, there is a heavy tendency towards the natural sciences. And this has been documented in different regions, but these are just some examples to sort of showcase this, if you like, thinking about the performance of different types or strategies of protection and use, from protected areas to sustainable use in terms of carbon in the Amazon, looking at the influence of different forms of governance arrangements on fire frequencies and also on biodiversity. And if we pause to ask then, well, what do we know about the impact of these? I'm sorry about these emails. I should have turned that off before. So what do we know about these interventions and human well-being? Well, there have been a couple of really useful reviews recently. So McKinnon et al. Led one, where they took the evidence and they looked at what do we know about different types of conservation intervention. we all know that conservation or conservation and development happen in bundles of interventions where different actions are brought together to come to play in a given site. And so they had a look at these different strategies or bundles of actions from the conservation toolkit. And then they collected the evidence to see what do we know about these against different domains of human well-being. And you can see in the graph or the heat map that they show very different levels of evidence depending on the different relationships. So we know a fair amount about area protection and economic living standards, for example, but we know far less about sustainable use, categories of land management across all of the domains that they include for well-being. Health is one domain of well-being that has been underexplored in terms of how conservation interventions are impacting health, and yet you can imagine health could be very salient in terms of local priorities for well-being. So it's an interesting piece of evidence that I think highlights, in fact, how our current knowledge is insufficient to think about comparative performance of different interventions on human well-being, as well as sort of, I think, enforcing that point, which is that economic and material dimensions of well-being really do dominate in terms of what we know about impact. Then Laura Rasmussen and colleagues did another review, but this time looking at the impacts of agricultural intensification on human well-being. And through their review, they show that win-wins are rare. So in the bottom left there, you can see the graph. In the top right, it's circled the green cluster of dots there in the green. They're win-win outcomes. So well-being has been positively impacted and ecosystem services also. And then on the flip side of that, you can see lose-lose is also fairly common and a whole different range of outcomes in between. What's also interesting here is that they disaggregated impacts on well-being by different types of ecosystem services and links to the landscape. And they show that depending what relationship you look at, outcomes also change. And I think that's an interesting thing to bear in mind. Where we look for the evidence does influence what we find, and it's useful to be mindful of that. They also showed that in terms of ecosystem services, there's a tendency to think about provisioning and supporting services rather than the cultural ecosystem services, which links to what we'll go on to think about later, which are relational values to the landscape. And again, this prevalence of income, food security, sort of more material metrics of well-being when it comes to looking at the impacts on people and on people's lives. So we also know that there are diverse visions of what it means to live a good life, to live well, and what constitutes ill-being and well-being. And concepts vary around the world, and of course at different scales as well. So, for example, there might be a more conventional way of thinking about affluence and assets, which you could also argue as a sort of wealth-based or potentially northern Western view. And then there are other visions, such as Juan Vivir from Latin America, where well-being is really integrated with the state of the landscape around, or of the resources and the environment around. And then these movements in Europe and in the US of sort of re-embracing, if you like, frugal living or back to the land. And each of those comes with different sorts of metrics or levels of emphasis on different dimensions of well-being. So it's diverse. And recognizing this diversity and moving beyond, I think, or expanding beyond the material prevalence of impact evaluation when we're thinking of well-being is important for a number of reasons. And when I made this slide, I thought, you know, there's too many here, I should scale it back. But actually, I think they're all important, and for sure there'll be more of them too. But if we think about this in terms of environmental justice, I think that's useful. You know, they have their three axes of justice, so recognition, procedural, and also distribution. And I think that it's important to bring this plurality as much as possible into our impact appraisals along each of these lines, you know, for each of these reasons. If we take the first one then, you know, relational and subjective dimensions of well-being likely matter most in the very places where lots of conservation and development intervention is happening. And, you know, it impacts also how we are able to contribute meaningfully to people's lives and livelihoods by understanding and opening up the box of how local perceptions of well-being are constituted. Then we can design interventions that actually feed into locally relevant metrics of success, thereby also backstopping our ability to do no harm. And also, I think it speaks to the current calls, which are resounding in, you know, in different spheres around decolonizing these interventions, aid, but also impact evaluation itself. You know, we need to, I think, open up and expand our metrics of success to capture this diversity, and then potentially weave in different visions of the future, co-creating futures, because of course whatever gets measured, or the metrics of success, determine the course of the ship or the direction of the trajectory. So hence the little figure at the bottom with the binoculars. You know, he's looking at the aim, and the aim determines the direction. And so it really is important to increase the recognition of different visions and priorities in terms of well-being, to make sure that steering towards those other futures is possible in particular contexts. And some work, for example, a paper by Noelia Dafra-Calvo and others in Global Environmental Change last year, shows that these sorts of plural valuation approaches are actually associated with better outcomes, in the sense of more just, more equitable, as well as more sustainable. Then I just wanted to add this in here because I think this is an important strand as well, which is that sort of dousing our understanding of impact in a human dimension is very compelling. The visceral experience of global environmental change, or of change brought about through interventions themselves, can actually, I think, add a very emotive element to what we know, as well as can be used then to constitute a more powerful language for change. For example, we did some work in the Indonesian peatlands, which is a very contested landscape with lots of different priorities and actors and flows of benefits and burdens. You know, that's really proven a huge environmental challenge in terms of governance. And we collected data from different stakeholders with these different priorities, and showed that these people, you know, from Singaporean land managers to landless farmers working on the oil palm plantations, and school teachers in the towns, this whole range of stakeholders, they all came together to agree that the humanitarian burden of the peat fires was unacceptable. And so it sort of suggests that actually sometimes framing our discourses about impact and change and the imperative for sort of alternative futures, if you like, to avert tipping points, etc., might be better steeped in this human dimension, you know, because stories are powerful. So if we're interested in in moving into a plural valuation space, then what frameworks are useful for us to do that? Well, just to give some background then in terms of a broader sort of picture framework, Bennett Pascual and his colleagues, including many IPES authors or people involved in that endeavour, have put forward this framework to sort of emphasise how diverse valuation can actually offer an alternative to the mainstream, which you see there on the left, which is a sort of linear process between very tangible values, economic, and then economic valuation. So that's a useful alternative. They show, starting off with these different perceptions of what living well means, and then going through to incorporate diverse values within our assessments. Then from the wellbeing community, there are many frameworks, and I'm sure you're familiar with them. Martha Nussbaum's has her central capabilities. There's the work of Sen and Sabrina Alkir, for example, and they all have different frameworks that offer alternatives to measuring well-being or broader views of what constitutes well-being. And this one here is from Alistair McGregor and his colleagues, three-dimensional well-being, where they argue that there are dimensions of well-being which are universal, so they apply everywhere, and they are the material conditions, the quality of life, which is more subjective, and then the relationality or the relational dimension. And so within each of those, they offer these domains, through which we can gather data and say something about each of the universal dimensions. And they suggest that domains can vary between places and be indicators too, but that the universal dimensions are consistent. And what's really interesting, I think, about this framework is the emphasis on the relational dimensions, although they have tended to be social to social relations in the wellbeing literature. But here you see that ecosystems and flows with the environment is included there, as well as social and cultural systems and economic systems. And the idea is that relationality here also looks at the way in which these conditions are produced and reproduced and have the capacity to continue into the future. So kind of bringing in then, if you like, casting the net wider for other frameworks that can help in this space of impact evaluation on human well-being. There's the work of Kai Chan, again, heavily involved in IPES, and his lens on relational values, which he's sort of coined a term there, but of course this is, the concept of relational values, perhaps with different labels, is not a new concept at all. But nevertheless, Kai Chan and colleagues have sort of tightened the focus to really articulate the importance of particular relationships between people and the landscape. So sort of moving beyond the intrinsic value of nature for nature's sake, and beyond the instrumental value of nature being useful and therefore valuable to us, to society, but to recognizing this relational contribution of nature in which, we derive identities, place attachments, different moral sorts of responsibilities to nature, which then define in some sense us and our own well-being, as well as he talks about the way in which the landscape itself enables particular cultural practices or social relations which are facilitated by the natural world, in the sense that then they become this relational sort of connection to it. So it's a range of values which are beyond the instrumental and the intrinsic, and often missing if we're thinking back, in the sense of impact evaluation. And this is something that's been sort of quite interesting to me in my current work. But if we want to engage then in plural valuation, what methods are available to us? Well, I wanted just to flag that we've been involved, and again, Natalia and I have a paper coming into here, but Julie Zaringer, who's a colleague at Bern, and I have been guest editing a special issue which collects different cases from around the world of trying to understand what's lost and gained in landscape transitions, both, transitions from processes of global environmental change, but also transitions in terms of a shift in governance or an introduction of a policy, and actually we also have some cases of sort of disaster and recovery as well. And there's a bunch of papers, and that will be out sometime late spring, early summer, and a number of papers that use different methods from the quantitative, qualitative, social methods to try to capture people's perception often of these changes. And one instrument I wanted to focus on was the Global Person Generated Index, which is a way to capture and understand local perceptions of, first of all, what constitutes well-being. And that's a process of asking people the 5 things which are most important to them for their well-being, and then weighting those in terms of their satisfaction with them through a distribution method. And then after that, asking about perceptions of impact. So how do people feel that an intervention has impacted them in their domains of well-being? So it's sort of some soft or sweet spot between a quantity and a quality approach. It lends itself to gathering local perceptions because it doesn't work on a list-based sort of introduction of a list or a set of predefined constituents of well-being, and it's at the same time somewhat systematic. So analysing the data after is fairly straightforward. But it does hinge upon this acceptance that perceptions are legitimate forms of evidence. And there has been I would say, a move towards that. And there's this nice paper by Nathan Bennett calling for a sort of more acceptance of perceptions as evidence to improve conservation and environmental management. And perceptions, lend themselves to being dismissed as anecdotal, but at the same time, of course, are really key to understanding how local people experience an intervention or a landscape change. And that's incredibly important to gain the social acceptability of intervention, build legitimacy, as well as improve performance ultimately, both in terms of the environment and well-being. So with that kind of backdrop then, I just wanted to take you to Brazil in these last slides and share with you some work that we're doing. It's just wrapping up now actually to be submitted, so this isn't published yet. But it's work in the Brazilian Amazon where we're looking at the impacts of different types of intervention across a spectrum of integration. So that's quite a mouthful, but essentially we've got sort of single sector style approaches, such as we have a protected area and also an agricultural intensification site, which is soy intensification. Those are 2 interventions that we have study sites in or communities in, and then 2 integrated initiatives, which are sustainable use reserves, but different forms of those. One of them is an extractive reserve where people, are allowed to live on the land and practice their traditional small-scale agriculture. Different levels of hunting are permitted, timber extraction to a certain extent, just for sort of personal use. And then the Flona, which is the national forest, and that has a slightly different focus and more emphasis on the timber side and more support from government institutions to manage that and to do so following sustainable extraction methods. And so we sampled communities in each of those interventions, and we applied the GPGI, and including that final step on how residents felt that these interventions had impacted them across those 5 domains or 5 constituents of well-being, which they'd cited as important to them. And we had a large amount of data, so it was around 1,500 responses that needed categorizing, and that's when the 3D framework came in very useful. So you can see here how we adapted that to fit our data and the different indicators then that fell in across these sub-dimensions. And I won't go into that in detail, but obviously very happy to discuss at the end, or if anyone wants to get in touch, then I've got my email at the end as well. But just to say, I think maybe it's interesting to note how packed the relational dimension was in this. There were really a lot of things people spoke about and cared about that needed categorizing within the relational dimension. And some of the key findings then from the work so far is that, first of all, we showed, or the data showed, that the prominence of material well-being, which is evident in conventional impact assessment, did not stand out in the data. So you can see here on those 4 graphs to the left, the Q, the R and the M along the x-axis are for quality of life, relational and then material dimensions. And you can see that they're coming out fairly consistently, and certainly material dimensions are not taking precedence. So quality of life and relational appear to be equally important. And then if you look to the far right in the bubbles, you can see sort of middle bubble on the top row is often the biggest one. And that tells us that the relational dimension of well-being is a strong contributor for people in these communities, in the sense that the status was very good. So it contributes readily to well-being. Yet we also show here, looking at the GPGI scores overall, which is a mix of weight and satisfaction, to give an overall score where 100 would be perfectly satisfied. So we show that the soy site, which is the intensified agriculture site, appears to have the highest level of well-being. But then if you look to the far right, you can see that that's not due necessarily to the impact of the intervention. The soy and that column of orange bubbles shows that null impacts dominate, positive impacts in the soy are fairly few, and negative are more common actually. So we can look at this in more detail. I mean, it's important, I guess, also to notice that the integrated approaches on the far right, the Flona and the HESEX, or the RESEX, sorry, they're doing better in the sense they have more positive. I mean, null is still dominating, but they do have more positive impacts than the single sector equivalents, although they're not really equivalents, but interventions. So we can dig into that more, and we find the same pattern is prevailing. Here in this graph, you can see on the left, the Flona and the HESEX. The positive impacts are along the top row and the negative along the bottom with a background of red. And there are more positive impacts than there are negative. Secondly, these positive impacts are across all the different dimensions of well-being. So there are quality of life, relational and material positive impacts, fairly few negative, whereas the flip is, or the impact footprint appears to be, the inverse. If we look on the far right, where we've got the single sector approaches. So we have in the protected area a fair amount of negative impact across all dimensions of well-being. And in the soy site, one thing that sort of stands out is the large bubble around health, in the sense people perceived that the intensification in the landscape was negatively impacting their health. And we do have data from focus groups actually that sort of elaborates on conversations around why people think this had accrued, you know, the theory of change or the causal chain linking intervention with impact. But because of the time restrictions now, I haven't gone into that here, but again, happy to discuss. So then we were interested in combining data on both the weight of the constituent of well-being, so how important it was to people, as well as the perception of impact. And what we see here then is the top right of these quadrants is where things which are important to people have also improved as a result of the intervention. So what we're looking for really in an ideal world is lots of bubbles and icons in the top right, because those are things that people care about and which are having positive impacts through the intervention. And we find that this top right is filled more in the integrated approaches, including on things such as health, welfare, social relations. Whilst in the protected area and the soy site, again, we see the flip. So it's not just that there's negative impacts on dimensions of constituents of well-being, but that these are also negative impacts on things people care about. So health, you know, is a highly prioritized part of well-being, and yet the soy intervention people felt is causing damages, as well as to their economic livelihoods and to the environment. So there's some concern really here and suggestion that integrated approaches are doing better. And to wrap this all up then into just some summary kind of key messages that I thought resonate well with the talk is, I suppose, stressing this point I'm trying to make, which you're probably all very familiar with already anyway, but that there's really an under-researched strand of the M&E work is around this multidimensional well-being. But what we can see, you know, in this work, and I think in the other frameworks that I sort of incorporated in the talk, is that there is a need to actually contribute to this area, because it does challenge, it sort of challenges the mainstay of material metrics. And whilst of course material metrics are convenient in many ways, it does run the risk of obscuring other values, which then raises the different sorts of justice issues, which I covered in an earlier slide. We also show that integrated approaches appear to do better, but, you know, perhaps still not good enough. So there's work to be done in terms of improving impacts, both impact alone and obviously impact in dimensions of well-being which are locally relevant. And I think that that has implications for how these interventions are managed in the land, and obviously underscores the need for cross-sectoral partnerships and integration, both of different, you know, values and knowledges, but also simply sectors and partners. And I think there's interesting work to be done in terms of trade-offs, because as we saw, you know, the soy site does have an overall higher satisfaction score with well-being, but we can see that there are burdens being accrued at the same time. And so thinking about the relationship between well-being and different types of harms or costs associated with that, I think is an interesting area. And it makes me think of, you know, Kate Raworth's donut and how to find the sweet spot. And finally, that plural valuation does lend itself to responding to these justice dimensions. And it is a way of raising visibility, bringing legitimacy to other values and including other perceptions in in our work, and sort of decolonializing impact appraisal. So I think that's all I had to say. There you can find my email and my Twitter as well. If if you're interested in any of this or would like to get in touch, I'd be really happy to hear from you and look forward to any questions.